Popularized in the mid-2010s, cinematic wrestling is one of the bizarre new developments of the wrestling world. With it comes the great and the awful. And today, we're going to be looking at both sides as I tell you about the bizarre world of cinematic wrestling and the history that comes with it. There's no better place to start our journey into the bizarre world of cinematic wrestling than Lucha Underground. Lucha Underground is the grandfather of cinematic wrestling. That's where it was really popularized. And the reason for that is their style. Their style obviously has a lot of lucha in it. But I'd argue the bigger part of their style was the fact that it was way more TV oriented than any other company. They would have these bizarre storylines including deaths and all sorts of things that you would not see in any other company at that time. And it was really revolutionary to the way that people viewed professional wrestling, the way this art form can be manipulated into something else for good or sometimes for bad. This was a new era of professional wrestling. And while it was limited to Lucha Underground for a bit, you would see it go into other companies soon enough. And that's when we start our journey into the Broken Hardy universe. The Broken Hardy universe is really where we put the bizarre in the bizarre world of cinematic wrestling. This was crazy. We were in the midst of another Jeff Hardy versus Matt Hardy feud, and if you've seen their work before together, you didn't have high expectations. It was a tough time in the history of TNA/Impact Wrestling, and the company really needs something big. At first, this seemed like a long TNA feud. Matt Hardy was doing a weird gimmick and fans weren't really for it. That's changed with the final deletion. The final deletion was a very, very unique match. A match that really brought a lot of interest back to Impact and showed the power of cinematic wrestling. I truly believe if this happened in the 2020s or any other period of cinematic wrestling, it might not have worked. But considering how unique this style of cinematic wrestling was and how different it was to the cinematic wrestling you'd see from Lucha Underground, it was a hit. It got its critique, of course it did, but it got a lot of praise, and it started to build an audience up for Matt Hardy that he's never really seen in his career. The only real time Matt Hardy was that over was probably his feud with Edge in 2005-2006. So this was huge for Matt Hardy, this was huge for Jeff Hardy, this was huge for TNA/Impact Wrestling. And they ran with the ball they had. Matt Hardy and Jeff Hardy were an integral part of their television for the next year or so. It took up a lot of screen time. It was a big part of their TV. And if you see how Impact is modeled today, they're probably the company doing the most cinematic wrestling because of the success they've had with it, with the likes of Broken Matt Hardy. And you can bet that the WWE wanted a piece of that pie. As soon enough, they started to dip their toes into cinematic wrestling. It started with the Wyatt family versus the New Day. And then a year or two later, you saw Bray Wyatt versus Randy Orton. A year or two later after that, you would see Woken Matt Hardy, their version of Broken Matt, versus Bray Wyatt in a final deletion-esque match. And despite the men involved, the likes of Matt Hardy, who made it work so well in TNA, Bray Wyatt, who you would see soon enough, has a creative mind that excels in cinematic wrestling, as he had arguably the greatest cinematic match of all time. We'll talk about that later. But they weren't going all in on it. They weren't letting these creative minds really put their foot forward with cinematic wrestling, and it just felt off. It never really connected, and sometimes it was downright bad. But as I mentioned, soon enough, WWE would get it right with cinematic wrestling, and it all started when the pandemic hit and they had to double down on it with WrestleMania 36. When it comes to Mania 36, this is where we begin the pandemic era of cinematic wrestling. It all starts with two matches, and those are the Firefly Funhouse match and the Boneyard match. I'm gonna focus more on the Firefly Funhouse match, as to me this is the greatest cinematic match of all time. This is what happens when you let a creative genius like Bray Wyatt, rest in peace, express himself and show how good he can be. And when you have a star like John Cena willing to go along with it, a mega star like John Cena, one of the greatest of all time, going along with Bray Wyatt's vision, you have a unique viewing experience that feels absolutely surreal to watch. This is a career retrospective match, really. It's a retrospective of the career of Cena, the lows of Cena, how Cena has buried talent allegedly, how Cena started off as a rookie, how Cena's the golden boy, how Cena should have turned heel with the NWO mentioned. You see all of these callbacks to what fans want from Cena, what Cena actually was, and it's beautiful because it's taking off those rose-tinted glasses and it's showing what Cena really was. They're showing the good of Cena and the bad of Cena, and Bray Wyatt being the one to show it, someone who has been affected by the Cena push, just adds on to it even more. Wyatt would take out Cena and we wouldn't see him for another year or two after this, so it felt huge for Bray Wyatt, and they didn't really capitalize on it as much as they should have at the time, but that's a story for another time. Then we move on to the Boneyard match between AJ Styles and The Undertaker. This match was the last Undertaker match, which, while the WWE might have not exactly known at the time, it was heavily expected because of The Undertaker's physical state. He couldn't really compete in a normal match, so having him retire in a Boneyard match, in a cinematic match more specifically, felt like the way to go. This match also main evented WrestleMania Night 1, which showed how much WWE valued cinematic wrestling at the time. It had a very positive crowd reaction, meaning WWE was 2 for 2 in pandemic wrestling, and All Elite Wrestling would soon follow suit with the Stadium Stampede match, another very successful cinematic match. This is probably the best that cinematic wrestling will get in the pandemic, as while there were some other great moments during the pandemic, now we have to talk about the negatives, which is when you oversaturate something like cinematic wrestling, which is meant to be special, sometimes it can come across as incredibly goofy. I think of the Swamp Fight, I think of the Money in the Bank match, which is quite mixed in reaction. Some people really like it, some people do not like it at all. And there's example after example of cinematic wrestling matches which didn't exactly hit the peaks of the Firefly Funhouse match, the Boneyard match, or its predecessors, Broken Matt and Lucha Underground. These companies didn't have the Lucha Underground style, so they couldn't use cinematic wrestling so often because it just wouldn't hit the same. It just didn't feel right. You had to do cinematic wrestling if the story called for it, and if you just have it in the middle of a regular feud, it felt off, to say the least. It really felt off. Cinematic wrestling still happens occasionally to this day. You still see it sometimes in Impact, you still see it sometimes in AEW. You don't really see it much in the WWE anymore. I feel like its legacy overall is positive. While yes, there have been bad cinematic matches, I feel like the great ones overshadow it. I feel like the Lucha Underground, I feel like the Broken Mats, I feel especially the Firefly Funhouse match showed how great cinematic wrestling can be. And if we keep with that in mind, I feel like one day cinematic wrestling could make a major comeback, and I'd be all here for it. Thank you for joining me. Comment down below, what do you think of cinematic wrestling, and if you think one day it could make a major comeback, like the video if you enjoyed it, and subscribe for more.